Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our open session. And I hope everybody is warm and snug wherever you are in the world. This is our second one for this year, or let's say in lockdown. Essentially, what we normally do with everybody, a great welcome to everybody, but generally we have an open session every quarter. But because of our lockdown restrictions, we are starting to do these more frequently. First, a welcome to you all. There are it's climbing. I think there's still some people trying to get into the room. We've got about 99 people in there. We've got about 130 registered, so you'll still be coming through. So I'll just do a little bit of an intro. A huge welcome to all of our regulars, always. The crew from Gina at Work, to Colin and the team, thank you very, very much for your ongoing support. A very, very big welcome this afternoon to the Alan Gray Orbis group that is joining with us. So we're very, very pleased to have you. If it's the first time at your open session for Flux Trends, then a very, very big welcome. Just to clarify, what happens at open sessions is this is an opportunity for Flux to present the research that we are really, really passionate about. Most of the year we have commissioned research, we do research for big corporates and companies, and the open sessions are research that we are really passionate about. The last open session that you might have joined us with was about Gen Z, and this is a continuation of that kind of theme. Because while we look at trends as business strategy, we look at the sort of disruptive trends, we look at trends that are shaping businesses, we're very passionate about the nuts and bolts of businesses as well. And that includes the skills needed for businesses that are in disruption. And boy, what a huge disruption we're in at the moment within lockdown. It is rather distressing for everybody. And I think the bravado about having everybody starting to reignite businesses. We're starting to find out, you'll see in our newsletter next week, I've just written an article about the second economic wave of impact. So today's topic is really, really important for us. It's about bridging the gap between the skills needed for the future for businesses that are changing all the time, and an education system which at Flux we believe is outdated and needs to be rethought, reframed, and re-engineered for this new digitalized world we're going into. So if you came in early to the room, you'll find out that I played two really opposing songs. The first one was from Coldplay, called The Adventure of a Lifetime, because I think, when you get into the world, you're a young adolescent, you're going into high school, it is an adventure of a lifetime. And then just before we started, I played Pink Floyd, Another Brick in the Wall. And that's an interesting one because if you know your film history, it's a 1982 film from Pink Floyd. And this was Another Brick in the Wall was actually penned by the bassist, Roger Waters. And it's a three-part song in the movie. And part two, which is Another Brick in the Wall, is really about a protest against the rigid schooling system, particularly about boarding schools. And in the sequence in the movie, if you go back into your archives, you'll see that children enter and march in unison through a meat grinder, and before becoming putty, or they call them putty-faced clones, before rioting and burning down the school. So we want to try and prevent that. But we kind of get the message that sort of the schooling system is really rigid. The sort of traditional schooling system was thought of and sort of spawned in the late 19th century and has kind of remained as such. And Bronwyn, who's presenting today, is going to go through that with you. But I just want to go through how it's going to work. Really simple. We've got about a 35-minute presentation, a very visual presentation from Bronwyn. We're going to be taking some questions after that. And I do realize that we are in this precarious load shedding zone as well, to add insult to injury. So we generally don't share our presentations. We normally just send you a take-home summary of the salient points. But because it is such a anxious driven afternoon for a lot of people to say, I might be load shed. If you're not, it's 7 minutes past 4. If you were due at 4 o'clock to be load shed, then you're probably biting your nails. But we'll soldier on, and if you are load shed and if you missed anything for any reason, we are going to send you the recording of today's open session, so don't worry about that. Before we kick off, I just want to introduce our team to you. So Tumi, Tumelo, she's in the chat room. Tumi, I don't know if you want to just pop your head in and say hello, but Tumi's going to be assisting you in the chat room. Tumi. And then over in Bahrain, we have Faiza. Faiza is the backbone behind the open sessions. She's running the back end, the production and all of that. So we are a truly global and virtual company. So
hi everyone. I'm having technical issues and I can't start my video, but I just thought I'd say hello. Hello and welcome everyone.
Great. Thanks, Faiza. All right, so I think without any further ado, if you are going to be tweeting for us, then this afternoon the hashtag is Flux Open Session, just one word, and then specifically education or hashtag future of education. So let's get started. It's a really, really interesting and thought-provoking presentation that Bronwyn's put together, and I'll just hand straight over to her. So Bronwyn, over to you. Bronwyn, I think there's a problem with the audio. We're not hearing your audio.
I'm getting onto that. Sorry, wouldn't connect over. Are we good? We're good.
Yes, now we can hear you. Good, great. Let's start from again. Yeah.
Okay, great. So as Dion was saying, thank you very much for coming and joining us today. I think that one of the most important things that we want to talk about when we start talking about the education system is how the system that we have with us today was designed very much for the industrial age. And it fulfilled really two different roles. The first role was to really babysit children so that their parents could go out and work. And the second role the education system provided us for was to train those children to become future workers or human resources in the more literal sense of the word, as I put on the slide over there, to provide those human resources to fuel the industrial system going forward. As the Henry Ford sort of context of industry was very much that your employees become your consumers, and it's this very sort of self-sufficient system. But we're no longer in the industrial age, not at all. We've moved forward into a knowledge economy, and we've got to start thinking about how we rejig the education system to create human resources that aren't just resources that are going to be performing a consumption production function in a very industrial machine, but rather become more complex beings that are able to solve problems and create value in much more useful ways to both themselves and to society at large. So in this presentation, I'm going to break up trends in the education system into two different parts. Firstly, we're going to look at basic education, and then we're going to move on to higher education. So to start at the beginning, so to speak, it definitely bears mentioning the world that we find ourselves in today, this ACVC world, as I call it, the after Corona, before Corona world, because we really are at a tipping point, a pivot point in our society. There's a lot of change going on at the moment. And as you can see on the screen there, there's some pictures of some poor children wearing social distancing hats. They got to stay 2 meters away from their fellow classmates at all given times. So those hats have a ruler on them or a balloon like that other little girl has there. And this really does bring it into focus how we need to start thinking differently about schooling. Because I don't know about you, but I am a parent, and when I see this and these children trying to wear these really rather ridiculous looking hats, and there's other images of children in schools in France who have to play outside in the playground in a socially distant 2-meter wide or 2-meter radius circle in the playgrounds, and it just looks so lonely. So we really have to start to think, as we go into a period of change that we don't have any control over, perhaps we do have some control over what we start doing at the end of it. And one of the first trends we've picked up now is this revival of homeschooling. Now, this is a revival both being forced onto us and a revival that people are choosing. So I've got there 2 pictures for you to see on the screen. The first would be a Victorian governess looking after her very privileged students. So children were getting one-on-one homeschooling education if you were privileged around about 100 years ago in the Victorian era. On the other side of the screen, I've got a picture of an overstressed working mom trying to figure out homeschooling in the age of Corona during lockdown while juggling homework, chores, everything else that goes with being both a parent and a worker today. And I thought that was a very interesting contrast, because homeschooling used to be something that was reserved for the very privileged and the elite, whereas the masses and majority of people sent their children to school in much more industrial schoolroom settings. Now, however, the masses are getting an opportunity to get exposed to homeschooling. And we've seen sort of 2 sub-trends developing out of this whole forced into homeschooling during lockdown scenario. The first is that America, for example, we don't have data from South Africa, but hopefully we'll be able to get that and feed that back to you after this event. But in America, they've now had record numbers of applications of parents applying for homeschooling for the long run. So these are parents that have decided that they have tasted homeschooling and they actually prefer homeschooling to the schooling that their children were getting previously. Now, these parents do tend to come from the more privileged strata of society. They're homes where perhaps not both parents have to work all of the time. Perhaps they have the luxury of having in-home help. But the point is that these families are seeing that the quality of education and the quality of the relationships between parents and children that come around from homeschooling makes it a sustainable thing that perhaps they hadn't thought of, but can now see the way forward to do it on the long run. On the other hand, we've got this other sub-trend of the overworked, overstressed parents who can't wait to send their children back to school. This would include single mothers who are trying to juggle a way to bring in income during these very precarious times and trying to do their best for perhaps multiple children in the home. And for them, it's very, very stressful. So like many things that we've seen coming out of the 2020 crises, all those different crises going on, is that trends tend to accelerate during times of crises. And they also tend to highlight divisions between society, divisions between the privileged and the not so privileged, between people who have the luxury of time and people that do not. Now, there's also another issue that's coming out from this move towards homeschooling, be it forced or voluntarily, and that is the fact that states and big universities, including quite infamously Harvard, are actually saying that homeschooling should be banned altogether, because homeschooling can exacerbate the differences between the privileged and the less privileged, children that have parents that are more educated and children that have parents that are perhaps less educated. And also, schooling traditionally was supposed to create social solidarity across various different stratas of society. So to build a collective culture and a collective set of values that would create a strong national identity going forward. Now, I'm not going to make a value judgment on whether you think that national identity is a net good or a net harm for society in a global or local context, but that is really the thinking behind it. And this lady, Elizabeth Bartholet, she is a Harvard Don that comes from Harvard Law School. She put on a conference, or tried to, but actually was cancelled because a whole lot of people on social media were quite offended by it. But she was going to put on a conference to say that homeschooling should be banned because parents might be able to indoctrinate their children if the state isn't able to be involved with raising those children. Of course, the converse argument, because there's always a converse argument, is that the parents that are pushing for more homeschooling at the moment are saying, but the state's indoctrinating our children. We don't necessarily agree with the narrative that is being put forward to our children at state schools, and we've picked this up during these last few months of doing homeschooling. So we're going to present to you those two views, but it does seem to be that going forward, we're going to see those two trends, to and from, towards and against homeschooling, gaining some traction. And coming from South Africa, a very unequal society, we definitely need to start thinking about that, because schooling is good at flattening the bar, or making sure that all children do have exposure to a level playing field by the time that they reach adulthood. So very interesting conversations to look at. Another thing to put into the mix right here, or another trend, is the German concept of Bildung. As you can see on the quote on the screen over there, Americans often think of schooling as the transmission of special skill sets. Can the student read, do maths, etc.? Whereas Bildung is designed rather to change the way students see the world and help them to understand complex systems and find their place in society. So this quote, this concept of Bildung, sees schooling as more than just education or babysitting, but also something of community building and collective consciousness building, which is something that could be lost if homeschooling does come to the fore. But at the same time, perhaps there's also some wisdom in there about schooling being more than just about grades. Now, to back up that whole concept of perhaps if they weren't so keen on homeschooling at all, if the Harvard elite didn't like that concept, they're probably going to like the unschooling movement even more. Now, the unschooling movement or trend is homeschooling, but even more extreme than the homeschooling as we know it today. Unschooling is homeschooling without a syllabus or a program at all. It is child-directed learning. Basically, the idea is teach your children how to read, or let them figure out how to read on their own, and then point them at the world's information and let the child guide their own learning journey through life. Now, you might think that this could not possibly end well, because what child likes to eat their vegetables and what child likes to do work? But the concept is that by making learning organic and more fun and more child-directed, the child actually becomes more engaged with the learning process themselves. So they start to see learning as self-development rather than as a chore, something that they have to do against their will. And there's a very interesting TED talk, you can go look it up, on hack schooling, which is about a very young child. I think he was around about 10 years old at the time, and he got onto the big stage at TED to actually speak about his experience in unschooling, and he's been very, very successful. And there's some quite interesting case studies of young children who have self-directed their learning journeys and gone on to be very, very successful both in entrepreneurship and in academia, because they have had an organic love for learning develop within them. Perhaps not for everyone, but definitely a trend that we're going to see spoken about more and more. Now, on the other end of the scale, perhaps the Harvard crew would be more amenable to this trend that we're seeing, and this is the trend of surveillance schools. So as you can see with these very regimented children on the screen over there wearing those little black headbands, those headbands are brain neuro interface devices, and they are designed to track the brain waves of the children in that class. Now, just a caveat before I continue, the particular primary school that you see in the pictures here has actually stopped using those headbands because there was a bit of public outcry on it, but they did use it for some months. Now, these devices monitor the child's brainwaves and notify both the student and the teacher if the child is losing concentration, and it can even start to monitor attitude towards work. So, of course, some artificial intelligence ethicists might disagree that's even possible, but the fact is that people are starting to use this data to try and optimize children's concentration and retention of knowledge. So as you can see, the complete diverse, complete opposite trend to the unschooling trend. It goes even further than that. They're also starting to test in Chinese schools haptic feedback uniforms. And these uniforms will buzz or let out an alarm if a child is late for class or if they're in the wrong part of the school at the wrong time. So this really speaks to almost an industrialization or reindustrialization of the schooling system. It's trying to make children more like machines rather than more diverse. But once again, very divergent views as to what is going to be successful. And as always at Flux, we want to present the information to you. You can make up your own mind as to how you feel about these various different trends and what you think is good or bad. And there definitely are some sort of signs that this sort of very regimented schooling is producing better purely academic results than perhaps some of the more laissez-faire Western versions of state schooling. But once again, it all depends on what you measure as being a successful form of education. Now, always, like we like to say, technology is not the enemy. Technology is a tool. Technology is designed for us to do more with less, so to become more productive and more efficient. And one of the more exciting trends we're seeing with blurring the lines between technology and education is the whole trend towards artificially intelligent adaptive forms of education. Now, artificially or AI adaptive education programs allow technology to help us to customize learning journeys for children or for adults doing professional development programs. So the artificially intelligent or the algorithms in these educational programs will direct a unique learning journey that adapts to your learning speed and your learning style, because we all learn differently. Some of us are more visual, some of us are more auditory, and some of us learn by doing. And because these systems are adaptive, they're able to customize a learning journey for every single child in that class, instead of just having a complete batch approach to educating children. And if anyone has spent any time in a school classroom with young children, you'll see how differently and how different the speeds are that different children learn at. So that makes quite a lot of logical sense if we can combine it with, as always, the human touch, which we'll get into a little bit more in just a minute. The next trend that pairs on very closely to that with AI in the classroom is the concept of VR, or mixed reality, or the metaverse when it comes to education. And this is very useful, particularly right now when children are locked down in their homes, they're unable to go to school, and they have not been able to do so for some months. When it comes to virtual reality education, educators are able to expose children to experiences they might not be able to afford to or to practically get to on their own. So we're seeing everything from virtual reality school field trips that you can go to different places all across the world on a very low budget, using even your smartphone. You can use this. You don't even have to have a VR headset for a lot of these experiences, or even going on school tours to the bottom of the ocean, or jumping on board Elon Musk's space rockets and going to the stars, all from the comfort of their own home for a very, very low cost. VR education is also very useful for teaching more technical skills when perhaps a school won't have the resources to have children play around with flight simulators even. They could do those sort of things in a gaming virtual type environment. And there's definitely huge application there, and we're going to see more and more of this creeping down into our schoolrooms, even here in South Africa. Perhaps more interestingly though, we've picked up this trends towards virtual therapy as well. So mental health is becoming a bigger part of the workspace and of the education space, and it's become more of a topic of conversations in families too. What's interesting is that the FDA in the United States has actually approved some games, some virtual reality games, as therapy or as a drug for treating certain mental wellness issues. So very interesting to see how those lines between health and education and therapy and gaming are all coming together in very, very interesting ways as we explore what we can really do with technology around us. Now that's all very exciting, but as always, there's another hand to the story, and that is the concern of the digital divide. Now, the digital divide obviously speaks to how some children have more access to data and to devices, to hardware and software, than other children do, and how socioeconomic status can be quite a big discounting factor for children who don't have access to all of those luxuries. Now in South Africa, that's a particular concern given how expensive our data is compared to other places in the world, but there are once again some solutions coming on board, such as the Starlink satellites that promise to deliver almost limitless internet data to pretty much the whole world at much, much cheaper rates than what we are used to. So there are signs of hope that that digital divide can be reduced, and that pretty soon even students in rural parts of South Africa and across the African continent can really have access to almost the same level of knowledge and the same level of fantastic experiences and customized learning journeys and all those online courses that children in first world countries have access to. So that digital divide could actually become quite a level playing field if you look at it the right way around. But once again, it's yet another way to look at this concept that becomes perhaps even more concerning from my perspective, and that is the risk of actually the digital divide turning around, as particularly poorer nations or nations that don't have as big an access to education budgets and to human resources to educate their populations. Once the cost of data and the cost of devices comes down, and it will, technology prices do tend towards zero over the mid and long term, we run the risk of actually that whole concept of the digital divide being something where privileged children have access to technology and less privileged children don't, flipping on its head to a world where less privileged children are taught using technology alone and more privileged children, just like that Victorian governess in the first picture that I showed you today, are able to be educated with the human touch, with real human connection. So we're seeing a world with high touch for the rich and high tech for the masses. And to quote Kathy O'Neill once again, she is quite a well-known data scientist and data ethicist. She speaks about how in the future, across all levels of society, the privilege will be processed more and more by people and the masses more and more by machines. And this is quite scary because it means the masses of the world's population are taught to become almost more like, once again, those cogs in the future economy systems, whereas your wealthier people are able to be processed like people and by people. I thought I'd leave it there in terms of the younger end of educational trends and what we've seen changing as to sort of 9 to 5 schooling that we had when I was growing up. To move on to the second part of the presentation, we're looking at trends in higher education. And as I titled the section, who needs a degree anyway? I say this as someone who's got a few degrees. I know Dion feels quite differently about the value of higher education. Once again, take everything we say, not as an opinion, but more as an information about what's changing when it comes to education and prepping people for skills and work ahead. The first trend that we have to mention, being in South Africa, is the whole issue of fees must fall, which is definitely not going to go anywhere. And as I've titled the slide here, fees have fallen, sort of. They've fallen in that pretty much all the best universities across the world are now putting their course content, this is course content from universities like Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge, onto online platforms, massive open online course platforms, where those classes and that content is actually available in most cases for free. So technically, higher education fees have fallen. In reality, not so much. Because if you are a poorer student, there's no way to access that information or to get a certificate or any sort of reward for going through that process without paying to get that certification. In South Africa right now, a year of higher education will cost anywhere between 25 and around 75,000 Rand a year. If you want to go to an international university, places like Harvard, once again, are charging more like 50,000 US dollars, which is the price of a rather nice house here in South Africa for a year's worth of tuition, which is really quite extraordinary. So that really brings us to the first point that I want to make today, and that's this whole concept of declining returns on investment on both time and money invested in higher education. And this is not just because university fees are increasing at above inflation rates, but also because as higher education becomes something more and more, a greater and greater percentage of any given country's population is able to achieve, the sort of status and exclusivity and the edge that getting a degree will give you in the job marketplace diminishes over time. So what increases social good and social value as more and more of your population get degrees, it also diminishes the relative status or the relative income premium you can demand as a graduate. And this is why you're sort of seeing almost an educational arms race, whereas a couple of generations ago, getting a bachelor's degree would give you almost guaranteed tickets into a good upper middle class providing job. Today, many people with masters or even MBAs are unable to find a job that allows them to pay back that money that they've invested in that degree and the time that they've invested in that degree that they could have been doing something else, starting a business, doing courses instead, or just working through that time. So those questions about the value of higher education, this is a very practical value calculation, are being re-looked at in many different families and many different communities across the world right now. It also really starts to beg the question, if, as I mentioned, those top tier universities are putting their course content out for free, what are you actually paying for? What are you actually getting out of that $50,000 investment in a Harvard education? Are you purchasing the stamp or are you purchasing the knowledge? Now, during lockdown, Harvard announced that it was not going to reduce its tuition at all, even though it's shutting down its campus. And in that way, the university really admitted that the only difference between the free content it puts out online and what you're paying for is the stamp, the veto that says Harvard thought that you were good enough, intellectually or academically speaking, to get into their program. So for that reason, we can start to see that very expensive stamp, because we're obviously not purchasing the education for that price, rather we are just purchasing the status, the stamp, the symbol. It almost means that those universities, those top tier universities, are functioning more as HR screening services than as teachers per se. So when you go and get accepted into one of these programs, pay that enormous fee, you are providing a signal to future employers that you are employable, that you have been endorsed by this HR screening service known as Harvard or Oxford, or one of those very, very top tier universities across the world. And this really gets us as trained analysts to start questioning that whole hiring process, to start questioning employers, to say, if you are really serious about reducing inequality and giving people more opportunities to get into the workspace, should we start looking beyond the symbol and the stamp that comes from, so sort of what university has endorsed this candidate, or should we start putting more effort into rating people based on their own merit when it comes to choosing which sort of employers or employees we want to bring into our organizations? And honestly, that's already starting to happen. Many big companies, we've been tracking this for about 5 years, Dion and I at Flux, are now no longer requiring a degree to get into that company. So companies like Google and Facebook fall onto this, as does Dorling Kingsley, the book publisher in the UK. They were some of the early ones that did this, but more and more companies are saying they no longer require a degree, they no longer require that stamp in order to qualify you to come into the potential HR recruitment pool for that company. And this is because the more and more analysts look at education and aptitude in the employment space or in the workplace, the more we see that attitude trumps academic achievement when it comes to how successful an employee is going to be in the organization and in the workplace. So that's not to say that degrees are valueless, but rather that we have to start rethinking about what that return on investment equation really is and what we're really purchasing and why we are really purchasing it. The sadder side of this trend, as we have on the one side return on investment in higher education declining, on the other hand employers more and more realizing they don't actually need those stamps in order to veto whether an employee would be a good fit or not, is we have an increasing gap between expectations and reality. And psychologists have commonly said that the difference between expectation and reality is really happiness. So if your expectations exceed your reality in life, you tend to be quite unhappy and discontented, and the converse also applies. And we've seen this through the rise of, as we call it, the bachelor barista phenomenon. That's where you've got young people who are very well educated, might have a degree, might even have a master's or a doctorate degree, but are unable to find a professional job and end up working in blue-collar professions, doing things like being bartenders or baristas, as you can see on the screen. And AOC, that very well-known politician in America, she was famously a bartender, even though she had an economics degree. And it just really goes to show that perhaps what we are studying and the sort of graduates our universities are producing are not necessarily a good fit with the sort of jobs that are available in the marketplace. This is just exacerbated by the fact that student debt has increased so much. So part of that ROI equation is this fact that student debt seems to be ballooning, and it's not just a personal crisis, it's a national crisis, particularly as there's more and more pressure for states to start sponsoring higher education to level that playing field, to reduce inequality in their nations. The student debt question becomes a bigger and bigger political hot potato. And really, when you do get a degree and you have invested some of those rates, you have invested the amount of, as I said, quite a nice townhouse here in South Africa into a degree, and you are unable to pay off that debt, that becomes a huge issue. And I think in the United States right now, there's $1.6 trillion worth of student debt. And on the next political election campaigns, that whole concept of writing off student debt is one of those big issues societies have to grapple with. Because of course, there are other questions that come up, and people that say that student debt shouldn't be written off include the majority of people who have never had the opportunity to go to university at all. So always these very, very complicated, very, very messy problems. However, there are some solutions coming out from the rising costs and the declining ROIs of higher education. The first one that I think is quite interesting is this whole concept of learn as you work, or corporate universities. So there's two ways to look at this. The first one would be literally corporate universities. Google has its own in-house university. So your company trains you, puts you through a course that is designed specifically for that company to know that it will make you a better employee or better worker at your job that you're already employed at. So very targeted education, but still with the credibility of a higher education qualification at the end of it. Other ones that are also similar to this learn as you work, or the employer pays for the education rather than the employee. The employer pays for the education or the skills that they require for their organization, rather than the employee taking on risk and debt and then hoping to find a job. The success story there, a local success story, would be, of course, We Think Code, which goes to corporates, asks them for what they need in terms of IT staff, then goes out and trains young South Africans for free, and those South Africans are almost guaranteed a job because they've been trained to meet a need in an organization. So those models of higher education are very, very smart, much less wasteful, and much more appropriate from a return on investment point of view for both the student and the workplace in general. So I think that we need to look at more of these win-win solutions rather than win-lose solutions when it comes to funding higher education. Another trend that's a bit more interesting, a bit more in-depth too, is this whole concept of personal shares, which is arising. This has come out of the crypto and blockchain space, but what it really is people like that really good looking lady on the screen over there who calls herself Coin Artist. She's one of the first people to have issued a non-fungible token that is a share in herself. So she is selling or giving away, in some cases, to collaborators that she works with, shares in her own person. So this is a way that we can also start to see people funding higher education. So at the moment, if you aren't lucky enough to live in a country that sponsors higher education, you have to take on student debt and pay it back. Just like when you start a business, there's two ways to do it. You can, if you don't have the cash yourself, you can either take on debt from the bank, or you can sell equity in your business. So personal shares are a way for students or prospective students to sell shares in themselves in order to fund their current education. So it's borrowing from the future, from your own future, rather than borrowing from someone else. So in some ways, it's almost a low-cost proposition or a no-risk proposition, because if you don't get a job after you finish studying, your shareholders get nothing from you. However, it's also essentially turning yourself into indentured labor or a serf, like you can see on the other side of the screen, because if you sell a share in yourself or an equity share in yourself, depending on how you structure the deal, you could end up paying back to your shareholders for the rest of your natural life, sort of becoming obliged to those people that have invested in you. There are midways between the two. One such example would be Lumber School in the United States, which does have a work-back agreement. So they will train you for free, but you then owe them a percentage of your salary until you've paid back your debt. At least that's got a finite end to it. Whereas personal shares don't necessarily have that finite end. Anyway, interesting things to look at on how technology can change that whole dynamic and that whole return on investment equation for higher education. But of course, there's another trend now where entrepreneurs are actually telling young people not to go to university and to rather enroll in an entrepreneurship program. If any of you were lucky enough to come on our Flux Innovation Tour, we did an innovation tour towards the beginning of this year before the whole world went into lockdown. Hopefully, when the sun comes out, we'll be able to do another one of those in the next couple of years. But one of the stops on our Josie Innovation Tour was the Innovator Gap Year here in Johannesburg. This is a program where young people can go to learn entrepreneurial skills for a year-long program that has been structured to give that young person structure, but it's not university education. Rather, it's almost like an incubation program that they're able to go on to discover what they want to do with the rest of their lives. It's very similar to the Peter Thiel Foundation's whole thing of saying, we will pay you not to go to university if you are one of the brightest students coming out of schools across the world. So quite interesting how successful entrepreneurs are suggesting to pay or to encourage younger people not to go to university or to explore different opportunities of how they can find their own way in the world. And that, I think, really ties on to how, if we are looking ahead to the future of education, we need to start distinguishing between work and jobs and between vocational and academic training. So other ways to put this is that some forms of education prepare us for a life of academia or a life of consumption, and other forms of education prepare us for a life of production and productivity. So some forms of education teach us skills that we will then use to build or make or work for someone. Other forms of education are more knowledge for knowledge's sake. This would be your more traditional forms of academia, where you would go to university to increase the general body of knowledge available to humankind. So your sort of pure science, your theoretical maths, that sort of thing. And I think that distinguishing between vocational training for jobs and academic training for more sort of self-actualization will help particularly younger people distinguish between what it is they want to do with their lives and how much they are prepared to invest in that return on investment equation. But I think asking that question will set us up for a lot more success going forward, particularly as that whole sort of all those things with the changes going on with technology and how automation is going to make a lot of current jobs redundant. It's not going to make people redundant if you can distinguish between your job and your work, so your vocation and what you're doing for a salary right now. And just a last point on the universities and the trend that we're seeing, although we don't want to make it about politics today, I think it's definitely worth mentioning that as universities become the epicenter of the sort of global culture wars that we're seeing on social media and on the streets across the world, we need to make sure that if we want universities to survive, and quite honestly, higher education systems are said to be one of the most likely to be disrupted by 2020 industries in the world, we need to make universities once again safe spaces for ideas rather than safe spaces from ideas going forward. So that was really the main trends that we wanted to talk to you about today. But just to close off with, we've got a few thoughts for the older people in the room, people that might already be workers, and how to link all of this education talk to the office space. So just a few observations. I think it's important to look, and if you're familiar with Flux, you've probably seen this slide before, is that the traditional industrial era life journey was quite linear. Go to school, go to university, get a job, retire, and hopefully get to enjoy your retirement before you go on a cruise and drop down dead from a heart attack and your insurance money runs out. That was sort of like the very simple life plan that we had. Whereas today, life's become a lot more complicated. We're having to reskill that much more times throughout our lives to keep pace of change. That's technological change and social change. If you consider that the average Fortune 500 company has a half-life of just 10 to 15 years, you can see that you're going to have to reinvent yourself many, many times over your life. So you're probably not going to find yourself just studying once, then getting a job and getting to work at that same job, that same career for the rest of your life. You're probably going to have to reinvent yourself, re-educate yourself almost continually. And even retirement is becoming a question as lives get longer and as life gets more complicated and more expensive. And one of the sort of solutions that are coming out of this, the lady on the screen there is Jane McGonigal. She is a futurist at the Institute for the Future, and she's come up with this gamification concept of education. This doesn't really exist, but it's a speculative way to think about how we can link micro-credentials to be a new way of education. So instead of just getting a degree, getting your stamp from that top tier university and then going off and finding a job, she's come up with this concept called EduBlocks, which is a way to record micro-credentials as we earn them. And she's suggesting that we use blockchain type technologies to track every single piece of learning or teaching that we all do as individuals to build up almost a currency of education that we can use to justify our value or our educational history to potential future colleagues or to potential future employers or to investors if we want to become a startup, for example. And she suggests that you should be able to earn EduBlocks for reading a book, listening to an audiobook, teaching someone else a skill, going to do a short course, going to do a long course. So really anything that you can prove that you have increased your personal knowledge with, you should be able to put onto the EduBlock chain to build your skills. So to gamify this lifelong learning journey that we're all on, and to quantify those hours you've invested in self-study as well as formal study. So micro-credentials might be a way to extend that learning journey throughout our lifespans. Then in terms of if we are wanting to robot-proof our career, because we always get asked this question, so we thought we just preempted today, there were 3 pieces of advice that we've been able to sort of distill down. If you're looking at what you should be studying, if you want to study what your next micro-credential or big investment in education should be, there are really sort of 3 skills that we call sort of humanic skills that you can use to make yourself more future resilient. The first one would be to make friends with machines. That is to get to understand what's going on in technology and to understand technology is a tool and how to use that tool in whichever area your profession ends up being in. So make sure you have a basic form of digital literacy going into the workplace. That would be the first piece of advice. The next one would be to learn how to make sense of data. We live in a complicated, noisy world, and people that are able to simplify, summarize, curate, and pull insights out of information will definitely be in demand going forward. And the third one is to remember to be human. You can't out-machine a machine, but you can absolutely add value to your fellow humans through the human touch. And that really means when you pull that all together, if you want to build a very useful future skill portfolio, you should try and accumulate hybrid skills. So a unique portfolio of skills that makes you a unique employer or a unique potential future human resource component for the industrial machine that we all live in. So unique set of things that make you irreplaceable. So that means diverse experience and diverse an accumulation of skills and education, and to try to turn yourself into a T-shaped people is something that the Harvard Business Review has been speaking about for some time. This is where you have a good general knowledge and a good broad diverse skill set, but you also have a particular expertise in a particular area that adds some depth to your skill portfolio going forward. And lastly, if you want to pull this all together, here are a couple of future jobs that you might be working in to show how all those hybrid skills come together and how being a complex, nuanced human being is definitely going to set you up for success in the future. So you might end up working as a data hygienist that is cleaning up someone else's messy social media portfolio that could get them cancelled. So in other words, going through all your tweets and all your selfies to make sure there's nothing that could compromise your future brand and your future employability. The second one is to be a metaverse designer. We have to start thinking not just about the terrestrial plane, but also about building and designing, that's clothes, buildings, interiors, you name it, in the meta space, Or you could be a biased bounty hunter, tracking down those weapons of mass destruction that I spoke about today, where technology could be stopping humans from limiting or from reaching their full potential. Similar to that, you could be an AI interpreter. An AI interpreter would be someone that helps humans or human resources to work with their robo colleagues and their robo bosses as machines start to take over more and more roles in the workplace. Or you could even be a DNA matchmaker, which is a bit more speculative. But as we start to learn about DNA and biology, which we do speak about in some of our other presentations, you could be able to help people to find not just colleagues, but even love interests that match to their unique DNA. And that is it from me today.
Great, thank you, Bronwyn. All right, data hygienist and DNA matchmaker. I think those are really, really interesting ones there. Guys, we're already almost actually at the top of the hour, so I understand that some people have to leave. There are a few questions that we will be answering. But first, well, I need to just say from the start, there's apologies are required because for some reason it stopped people at 100. So we had a lot of irate people trying to get into the session, which we couldn't, and we could not do anything about that. So if any of your colleagues have been locked out, we have said that we are going to share the session with them. We will make good on that. But unfortunately, this is the time of video conferencing glitches, all of those kind of things. We really, really did not expect our account suddenly to block people at 100. So huge apologies for that. We will send out the recording to everybody and make good. So if you have those colleagues that were locked out, please pacify them. You can't give them a drink because we can't buy any alcohol. But please just say that we will. I'm going to go through some questions quickly. Thank you so much for the chats. I think, Bronwyn, you rattled some cages and got a lot of comments through there. Before I just go through there, just to remind you all that we have got a new service. That's a resource which we've decided to push out there, so you see what we see. On our website, it's trend cards. You can sign up monthly, you can sign up for 3 months, you can sign up for a whole year, but essentially you get a feed of the kind of trends that we analyze and have a look through there. Shailendra, you've been a superstar in the chat room and the questions here. I'm going to answer just one of them sort of collectively, and then I'm going to ask Bronwyn to answer the other one, and especially one from Nontando. I'm going to come to you, but Shailendra, there's just, I think, quite broadly, because you asked about, should our kids be taught farming at school? I think I'm going to ask Bronwyn to say, besides the pandemic, what is going to take to overhaul an archaic education system as well? You also said, high touch for the rich and high tech for the masses. Isn't that just another form of racism? I think it's another form of, technological inequalities, or a different kind of Gini coefficient. But one of the things that we advocate a lot, especially when we do HR keynotes to different companies, which Shailendra, that will probably answer your question, is the kind of a new concept of a career portfolio. So the slides that mini sabbaticals, further learning, doing that, and we unpack this in our Gen Z presentation a couple of weeks ago, is differently. And I think we've got to really get out of the mindset that the career trajectory that you embark on today is not going to be the same one that gets set. You're not only going to move from one company to another company, but you are going to change lanes completely from one sector to another sector. We've been looking at this and studying at this for such a long time. You're just starting to see those lines being blurred, and that your skills that you thought were only particular to one sector are suddenly needed by another one because of the nature of digitalization and the way things are happening very, very quickly. I'm going to just pass that other question on to you, Bronwyn from Shalendra is like, what do you think it's going to take to overhaul a current system? Well, specifically in South Africa, that's a big loaded question there.
I think in South Africa we're not at that stage of the masses being processed by machines quite yet. I think we're still on the other side of the digital divide, and what happens is we tend to go too far in the one direction or back again. But we do need to make sure we have a basic degree of digital literacy across our schools, and that our young people are able to access all that amazing information that is available on schools across the world right now. What I do think we need to do quite urgently is re-look at our school syllabuses. We need to get to a point where our schools, or by the time a child gets to the end of school, they already have a way to earn a living, instead of just using school as a stepping stone to get you into university to like jump through the next set of hurdles. Our children go to school for 12 years plus grade R's and grade noughts and grade triple noughts, and we keep on going down the scale there. What are we doing with all that time? Are we making sure that our children are getting life skills out of that, they're able to go and earn a living for themselves, even if there are no jobs available? And that is the question in South Africa. We can't be guaranteed a job even at the end of getting a university degree. We have to be able to turn our children self-sufficient. So teaching more things like entrepreneurship in schools, teaching things even like foresight and future studies. So I've been involved with a school called Dexter School. They're an online school, and they do amazing things. They teach children how to think creatively and to think about the reaches of technology and society that are available to us that we're just not exposed to. So if we expose our children, saturate them to more ideas, we'll probably get more out of the school system that we have.
All right. Nantana, I'm going to come to your question here, and then Bronwyn, see if you wanted to answer this one. As organizations offering scholarships, how should we be thinking about how we structure our support and programs to remain relevant with where education is moving forward? I think that's a really brilliant question, because it goes in line with things that are not set in stone, and things that start changing lanes a lot. Have you got any thoughts on that, Bronwyn?
I do have some thoughts, and then I'll come back to that whole concept of corporate universities. So scholarships are perhaps still one degree removed from that, bridging that link between education and employment. So if you are fortunate enough to be able to be in a position to give scholarships to people, why not think about how you can actually start curating with business schools or with universities unique programs? So why not get involved a little bit more further down that chain, because you'll get more out of that as an employer, and so will the future employees that you're bringing into the fold. So I suggest that that's probably my challenge to academia and to employers and businesses, is to work closer together, and rather just say, oh, we're going to deal with whatever the universities put out. I think there's massive opportunities to collaborate.
All right, a question here from Tulare. Yeah, good ones, because these are really sort of localized ones here. You said, Bronwyn mentioned that the talk is not political, but our situation in South Africa is very much so. How are these trends and ideas communicated to government? Gosh, that's a big one to try and answer. It says, we in education seem to be pushing against an immovable force in education regulation, being sensitive to the harm and pain COVID-19 has caused. It's more than anything else, maybe what forces said regulators to evolve and embrace new methodologies in education. And then Tulare asked another one, is South African businesses ready to evolve? They care about degrees. Has government listened or understood about those trends? Why don't you think about that, Bronwyn? I'll just have a quick jump in there. I had the pleasure of speaking to my alma mater at the beginning of the year, my high school, and we had agreed as well, when talking about these things, we came to the conclusion that possibly the careers day is not so much for students, but actually for the parents, because the parents that are pressuring their kids into, you've got to do this, you've got to do this, for this parent. That's how something can we go about this? Bronwyn, are you just have any thoughts about how the government here is able to do that?
Yeah, I suppose political will is always a challenge. We are a small organization, but I think once again, there's definitely scope for collaboration. And I say this just based on the fact that I've been quite involved with the whole crypto scene here in South Africa over the last few years. And for me, it's been quite encouraging to see how industry can work with government if you go into them with solutions rather than just with problems. And I think that in general, we don't have enough bridges built between academia, politics, business, private sector, public sector. We need more bridges being built. We need more connections in those nodes. That's not perhaps the sort of the answer you were looking for in this question, but that would be a sort of a high level observation from where I sit, that we can't give up. We have to speak more. There are legal and political challenges or channels that we can be exploring to make sure that our voices are heard. But I think that the key is to go with proposals and with solutions, not just with this is what the problem is.
Bronwyn, your connection's just stuttering you a little bit. So while that sort of buffers, apologies. The living now of kind of virtual webinars and internet connections and yeah, load shedding as well. That's got something to do with that. So while Bronwyn's connecting to a question from Eurissa. Eurissa asked, what do you think the country needs to do to break the huge digital divide, and is that possible? Eurissa, this is one of the biggest fears that I have for South Africa, because not only do we have the largest Gini coefficient on the planet, and the technical digital divide is really going to this has really exposed the really bad cracks that we have in our system. The only thing that I can say about that is connectivity, because I think once you are able to do that, you're able to mitigate some of that digital divide. It's not going to be perfect because you still need devices, you still need the hardware. But just today, I picked up 2 stories on our trend feeds. One is a 2-year test that's been good in Kenya, so not South Africa, but it's in Kenya. It's with a company called Loom. It is it's a subsidiary of Alphabet, one of the Google companies. And basically, for the 2 years, they've been seeing these huge. They're the size of when you spread them out, they're the size of tennis courts. And basically, what they are is they're hot air balloons that fly through the air, and they beam internet coverage to very rural areas. And as contentious as this is, with America and the UK now just suddenly banning Huawei because of the 5G fears, Huawei has also in turn put up a lot of quite rudimentary but very successful masts that are able to give people connectivity in very rural areas and with very, very simple kind of technologies and things there. So I think that is what we need to do to try and break that digital divide. And I think, as they said, internet connectivity is a human right now. It's not just a luxury, and I think that would be there. I'm going to question from Ricardo. Ricardo, you've got actually, well, you just changed that one. What is the link, maybe Brandon, hope your connection is stable again. What is the link between curriculum and the qualification and depth of insight of those delivering the curriculum? Did you get that?
Oh, I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that question, but I think that the curriculums suffer from the same problems that policy and regulation does, in that they're very expensive to set up and to implement, and very time consuming to implement. And that means that they tend to be sometimes even almost outdated by the time they are approved. So I think that there is a challenge there in terms of regulation and fast tracking syllabuses and curriculum updates through the system and all the various different hoops that we have to jump through, particularly at higher education levels. We've got to get everything certified, and to try to speed that up to match with the speed of change going on in the world outside of academia and outside of politics. And that's not an easy thing to fix, but it is a problem that can be diagnosed and that can be looked at, to say, how do we speed that up? And we've spoken about like the Roivant pharmaceutical companies, of how they put together their crack team of external minds to try and think about how to fast track those changes through the systems. And they were quite successful in a very diverse industry, but I think the principles apply here too.
Okay. And then, Bronwyn, if you don't mind, just because the internet connection just stuttered your answer, just if you can just briefly just compact that, the question that was asked by Tulare, just about government and how do educators really push against this immovable force? Just a short recap of that answer.
I think the things that educators need to do is to start going to government with proposals, so to actually band together as industry makers and to go put it forward to government as to what you want to do. I think that I saw how that could be effective in how the crypto industry has banded together with proposals to get regulation for their own industry. Actually done quite quickly. I think some of the fastest regulation in the world has come out of South Africa. There are ways around it if we start seeing government rather than as a sort of adversary, to see them more as a service provider, which is what they really are. So sometimes the tail does have to kind of wag the dog, if you want to use that analogy there.
Great. So I think I've just been told that it was my connection that's been stuttering. So apologies for that. I think there was from the responses, somebody wanted to respond to a question. Maybe you can put it into the Charles, maybe you can put that into the questions as well. And there's one for needs to change. That's an interesting question. I think we should all be constantly changing the way we upskilled, and I think it'd be made more frequently. But Bronwyn, do you have any thoughts on how teachers should actually be upskilled?
Yeah, I think teachers have to be lifelong learners themselves, but not just the fact that everyone that teaches is learning all the time. I know I've done a bit of teaching, so I know how this works. But yeah, I think that teachers have to be continually learning the newest technologies, the newest systems, the newest thoughts. It can't be, once again, just like that linear life plan. It doesn't apply to anyone. It doesn't apply to teachers either. You've still got to be upskilling, micro-skilling, credentializing yourself as you go along. I think that a lot of teachers are doing that already, so I don't want to say that it's something that's not being done. Perhaps the sort of skills that are being taught should once again be hybridized, so looking at across industry, bringing once again education closer to the workplace rather than divorcing the two, as we've tended to do in this very industrialized system that we have right now.
Okay, great. I think we've covered most of the questions. If there are any other questions that you have, please just put them into the Q&A right now, but I think we have answered most of yours. Shailendra, I hope we've been able to do that. There's been quite a lot of ones. So, like you said, is it better to be a specialist or a generalist in this field? I think Bronwyn's whole point about hybrid skills, I think, is kind of where we are going. And if you also look at the structures of corporate companies, I do a lot of talks about and looking into innovation. And I think what stunts innovation most is, and that's what we need at the moment, are those sort of very hierarchical, very siloed businesses. And we are starting to see the lines between the silos blurring more and more and more. So, perhaps not being a generalist, but being definitely a hybrid kind of skills worker. And yeah, Bronwyn, go ahead.
I'd say both. It comes back, it was one of the last slides that I put up, the concept of being a T-shaped person. So you want to be a generalist, like a general knowledge generalist, but also have a degree of specialization somewhere. So it's not about one or the other, it's really about both. And that's good for you. So I know it sounds very exhausting to have to be a generalist and a specialist, but only by exposing yourself to sort of lateral ideas can you find out what your real passion is. So you almost got to think about yourself as having a vertical and a horizontal, like one of those slide rulers, where your depth might change, but your general overall base knowledge keeps expanding too. So go broad and deep. That would be my advice.
All right, I'm just checking through the answer. Was this part of a chat that was happening just about kind of, where the parents' roles are and everything, because that's, for me, is also a very key thing to unlocking the different education is changing parents' minds. And because of the nature of what we do, Bron and I both get inundated from parents are saying, what must my child learn? He or she's in matric, and what are the future skills that are we doing? I go completely the different direction, and you would have heard this if you join us for Gen Z, but I always remind parents that your child's brain only settles into adult thinking mode around 21 or 22. And yet we are kind of programmed because of our system to push all of our youngsters into a academic pathway at 17 or 18. And then we wonder why 4 years later, they say, Mom, Dad, you know what, I don't really want to do that. I want to do something completely different. The parents go apoplectic and they say, you've wasted all this time, you wasted all this money. And then I remind the parents that actually, no, they pushed the learners or their kids way too early, and they should have maybe done all of those kind of in-between intermediate things, that gap year, the very different things, travel, all of those kind of things, to gain that I love that German, the Bildung again, to kind of be a well-rounded human. There's any closing thoughts with you, Bronwyn, before I close for today?
Yeah, I just think, as usual, hopefully we've equal parts scared and inspired you, because the future is up to all of us. So if we don't like any of these trends we've presented, well, and then you've now got the mandate to go and resist them. And likewise, if you think any of these ideas are good, I think there's quite a few opportunities that we touched on today that have not been implemented in South Africa. So if someone's looking for their next thing, their next pivot, their next move, there might be space for you to start building some of those concepts. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Bronwyn, and to everybody, once again, thank you so much for joining us, and for the 70 or so that have stayed for the Q&A. Thank you very much for staying. And again, if you have colleagues that were inadvertently locked out, we will go back to Zoom and double check that, and we will probably host our next session on Webinar Jam, in case it keeps switching things in the back end. We apologize profusely for that. So if you have any colleagues that were locked out, please just assure them they will get the recording. We will make good on that. All that's left for me to say is that we're having a very special session in about 2 weeks' time. It is not the normal open session that we have with this kind of format. It is a completely different one. On our website, and if you've signed up to our newsletters, you'll see we are going to be hosting a mini masterclass. What we're finding with this kind of the business temperament at the moment is it's really obviously very depressed. We have a lot of business owners and executives that are not quite sure where to turn. So what we are just going to do is we've put out a survey, and we're asking all business owners for this masterclass, what is your greatest challenge that you are facing now in this lockdown phase or in this pandemic phase, and how is that affecting, it's not only affecting you as a business leader, but it's also affecting your workforce. What we're going to do then is collate the most common asked questions, and we will do the research for you, and then we will present this at this mini masterclass. So we will be able to tackle those very real questions that you have as business owners as best we can with the research that we do. So in essence, it's a service that we do have for our corporates. It's called a Trend Spot in Residence. So we're actually offering you that as a service to the public, is use us as Trend Spotters in Residence for this time, and answer the survey is what would you like to ask Flux, firstly, and secondly, what is the main challenge that you are facing as a business owner? And we will try as best as we can to research the best case studies globally and come up with an answer for you. So that's on the 30th of July, at the end of the month. Please join us then. And once again, thank you very much for joining us. I hope the stuttering of internet and load shedding and stuff like that was not too much of a challenge, but we will send recordings out to everybody. And once again, we'll hopefully see you next time. So from the Flux team, thank you very much. Keep warm, and good night. Thanks.